Have you ever staged a prison break? I'm not talking about from some minimum security jail that they send rich convicts to and they can get in their chauffeured limousines and go home anytime they want to by walking out the front door. No, I'm talking about a military prison on a military base, the kind of place that have Marines with guns and that sort of thing. That's how I spent my last day in the Navy. And this is the story. Now, the Navy doesn't know this, but it's been 50 years, and I suspect the statute of limitations has long since run out. I had volunteered for the Navy because my draft number was 12, and there was a little thing called Vietnam going on. I went to officer candidate school. I graduated from officer candidate school, and now it was time for them to assign me. Well, I had a degree in physics. At this point, the Navy proved it's run by the same government that runs Amtrak. I was assigned to Naval Justice School. Now, I will be completely frank, I thoroughly enjoyed being a legal officer in the Navy. I saw some interesting times. I got to work for myself, and there's other stories associated with that I won't get into here. Now, I wasn't planning to make the Navy a career. I was following the old adage of military service being like sex, that the closer you got to discharge, the better it felt. Well, a day before discharge, I was feeling pretty darn good in the winter of 1975. What I did with that final day, well, this is the story. Fireman Matthews was having trouble with the Navy. Now, he's not the first, and certainly not the last person ever to have trouble with the Navy. However, his method of expressing his frustrations was unacceptable to both the Navy and normal human beings. He was setting fires on our ship. Now, he was also, of course, reporting the fires and putting out the fires, but nonetheless, the Navy was noticeably upset about this behavior, as, well, they should have been. Well, when the inevitable arrest came, he was sent off to the 32nd Street Naval Station in San Diego's brig to be held for court-martial. I decided that he needed to go see his parents after he'd been there about a month. It was now my last day in the Navy, and I was no longer legal officer. In fact, I had not been legal officer for several weeks at this point. I may have neglected to mention that to the brig officer. I got on the telephone the day before I wanted to release Fireman Williams to come over to our ship. Now, what he should have said at this point was, hell no, not without the brig commandant's signature and your captain's on release papers. What he actually said was, fine, we'll do the paperwork when you get here. When I showed up the next morning at 6 o'clock in my uniform with my lieutenant junior grade pips nicely polished on my shoulder, the ensign on duty there was somewhat more clued in than the person the night before. He said, hell no, not without the signature of the brig commandant and your captain on some release papers. Well, I figured that at some point the rules would rear their ugly head, so I had a well-prepared temper tantrum. This temper tantrum was helped by the fact that I was senior to the poor officer. I told him that the previous evening they had told me that if I came over, we could do the paperwork then and they would take my signatures. This was true. It may have been the last true thing I told him, but it was true. I did tell him that our captain was playing golf with the admiral of the base, and that I wasn't going to go and interrupt this game to get signatures when I had already been told my own were good enough. Well, eventually, as I continued to lecture him, the ensign gave in and said, fine, I'll release him on your signatures. Now, he failed to say sir, but under the circumstances, I decided that I would allow it to pass. He called the Marine Guard, and within 10 or 15 minutes, the Marine Guard showed up with Fireman Matthews and 2 copies of the release papers, one for me and one for the brig, which I dutifully signed. However, the poor officer was so befuddled by this time that he gave me both copies of the release papers. I left, Fireman Matthews in tow, and headed out the door and off the base to take him to see his parents. Now, I had the only records that he had ever been released from the brig. This was the days before electronic records, so they had no way of establishing anything except for the paper records that now said he was still there. I took him up to see his parents. He spent the day with them doing I don't know what. I went off and did other things, and late in the evening, I collected him. Now, I took him back. We went back to the brig at 32nd Street. I attempted to turn him over to the brig. They were completely befuddled as to why I was attempting to put someone in the brig who was already in the brig. It took some explaining on both my part and Fireman Matthews' part that he was supposed to have been released to accompany me to the ship to sort out his things from our things, and that he was now being brought back. And I showed them my copy of the release papers. Eventually, they agreed and said, fine, and took him back in. I left. 4 hours later, I was in my unmodified 1973 Ford Pinto, heading for, as far as the Navy was concerned, parts unknown and a civilian. Now, some months later, I was back in California. By this time, Fireman Matthews had been released from the Navy and released from the brig. I looked him up and told him the rest of the story about how he had been released from the brig and gave him a copy of the release papers. Now, I have no idea what he did with that copy of the release papers, but I still have mine.